kunjani uphilile na bendicela umzuzu wokuthetha nawe mna molo sisi kunjani uphilile na bendicela umzuzu wokuthetha nawe mna Molo sisi kunjani uphilile na bendicela umzuzu wokuthetha nawe mna ndithi molo sisi kunjani uphilile na bendicela umzuzu wokuthetha nawe mna yabona ndikubona izolo udlula ndaphelelwa ngamandla mna kuba bendibona umama wabantwana bam yabona ndikubona izolo udlula ndaphelelwa ngamandla mna kuba bendibona umama wabantwana bam ndithi molo sisi kunjani uphilile na bendicela umzuzu wokuthetha nawe mna molo sisi kunjani uphilile na bendicela umzuzu wokuthetha nawe mna yabona ndikubona izolo udlula ndaphelelwa ngamandla mna kuba bendibona mama wabantwana bam ndikubona izolo udlula ndaphelelwa ngamandla mna kuba bendibona mama wabantwana bam ndikubona izolo udlula ndaphelelwa ngamandla mna kuba bendibona umama wabantwana bam Zappa, 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 yeah. All right, good evening. Good evening, good evening, good evening. It's so lovely to see you all. I feel so close to you tonight, but that's a good thing. We miss being close to people. Welcome to the California African American Museum. If tonight is your first time joining us in person or virtually, welcome. My name is Alexandra Mitchell, and I have the distinct honor and pleasure of serving as the Manager of Education and Public Programs here at CAAM. If you're coming back, welcome back. It's lovely to see you and to have you with us for another evening. What a privilege and an honor it is to have you with us for this evening's in-person conversation and continuing our celebration of Sanford Biggers' exhibition Codeswitch, the first survey of quilt-based works by the New York-based interdisciplinary artist. During tonight's program, John Jennings, in the visual world of Sanford Biggers' Codeswitch. Jennings, a New York Times bestselling author, graphic novelist, and curator, will discuss Mother Patchwerk, the powerful video and graphic essay he contributed to the exhibition catalog, which will also be on sale directly following the conversation this evening. Sanford Biggers Codeswitch was co-organized by the Rivers Institute for Contemporary Art and Thought and the Bronx Museum of the Arts. The exhibition at CAAM is curated by Rivers Institute, and this is the first project in a multi-year collaboration between CAAM and Rivers. A big, big thank you to Andrea Anderson and the Rivers Institute for helping to make tonight's program possible. I could go on and on about our incredible guest this evening, who was a previous Harvard Fellow, a 2018 Eisner Award winner. Jennings currently serves as a professor of media and cultural studies at the University of California at Riverside. Jennings examines the visual culture of race in various media forms, including film, illustrated fiction and comics, and graphic novels. He's also the director of Abrams Comic Arts imprint Megascope, which publishes graphic novels focused on the experiences of people of color. Lastly, Jennings is the co-founder and organizer of the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Cultures, Black Comic Book Festival in Harlem. He's the co-founder and organizer of MLK, NorCal's Black Comic Arts Festival in San Francisco, and also SoulCon, the Black and Brown Comic Expo at Ohio State University. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome John Jennings.
How y'all doing? Oh, password, sorry. Thank y'all for coming to see me speak about this wonderful collection of work. Let's see here. So let me get the tech rolling here. Sorry, it's not mirroring, I'm sorry. And of course, we went over this. So, let's see here. Yep. Definitely Murphy's Law, right? So, let's see here. Sorry about this. I did this on purpose. Okay, there we go. Again, thank you for coming. Sorry about the delay. So I want to thank everyone for coming out, but also the CAAM and Alexandra Mitchell and her staff, and for supporting the work, and basically, bringing me out from Riverside. Also want to thank Sergio Bessa from the Bronx Museum, who actually helped put together the show, the original show. My friend David Brame, who worked with us on the graphic novel, and also Esperanza Bay, who did a bunch of editing and also writing for the piece called Mother Patchwerk. Also, just thank you again for supporting and this wonderful space. So first of all, what I'm going to do is show a piece that was commissioned after the graphic work was done for the catalog, and it's a short piece that's based off of the original illustration work that we did that's in the catalog. Let's see here. Well, thank you. Feels odd, taking praise for someone else's work to a certain degree. I didn't do the animation on it. In fact, it was, well, obviously you saw who did it, but when we originally were commissioned to do the project, it wasn't, there was no animation included in it. So I was very surprised that they actually wanted to do an animated piece to go with the illustrated piece, which I think turned out quite lovely. So I was going to come with like some kind of clever play off of code switch and come like code stitch, like stitching things together. I decided to just lead with the beautiful work that Sanford has already afforded us, right? But essentially, what I want to talk about is the origins of the project, a little bit of the process, and then I've been instructed by Alessandra to talk about my own work as well. So I'm going to try to squeeze that into like a 40-minute talk. So anyway, wish me luck. so, so the story of how I met, so I'm going to start with how I met Sanford, actually. It starts in Japan, like a lot of stories do. I actually am really good friends with Fernand Che Wilkins, who used to teach with me at the University of Illinois in African American Studies. And he took a job at Doshisha University in Kyoto. And it turns out that he and Sanford went to school together at Morehouse, and it became like really good friends. And so basically what was happening is that the 50th anniversary of the American Studies program at Doshisha was happening, and the theme was called Nippon in Black. So Nippon is the ancient name for Japan, and the whole thing was about like cultural exchanges between African American culture and Japanese popular culture. And so Fanon, who was now the dean of the college there, decided to put together a collection that was co-sponsored by the actually, I think it was the U.S. consulate in Japan, to bring together a collection of Black artists who work in that fashion, um, including Iona Roselle Brown. I know, right? Yes, yeah, I know. She's one of my favorite people. And so yeah, so we became really good friends while we were like working on this project. So both Iona's work and Sanford's work, of course, at the time were very much infused with Japanese cultural artifacts or having conversations about the tensions between sharing of different cultures. In my work, I do a lot of work around comics and curation of comics. So they wanted me to put together a collection of work by African American artists who are very much influenced by manga, it's Japanese comics, or anime. And so we did this show together and became good friends, and I just stayed in touch with Sanford over the time. Now, of course, I was always a big fan of his work because of the way that he effortlessly takes performance, pastiche, cultural theory, and sculptural aspects, and actually merge them into like a really, really truly interdisciplinary practice. And I saw a lot of the things that I wanted to do mirrored in that work. And at the time, I was actually teaching at the University of Illinois, like I said, and I created a class called the Visual Culture of Hip Hop. And so everything about the class was really talking about well, how do you take the ideas of sampling and remixing and then actually kind of like translate those into a visual culture? And so not just like, oh, well, it's graffiti, actually showing graffiti, which is one of the elements of hip hop, but thinking about the actual practice of sampling and remixing and then reappropriating those things into what I call a CJ instead of a DJ, right? So I would use Sanford's work as exploration, into that. And actually, over the years, he's been really kind to actually Skype in and talk to my students about his practice quite a few times. One of his other talents is like his very generous scholar. So of course, this is in the show, but it's a meditative mandala of sorts that's actually like a dance floor for the. I think this is a rock steady crew. So one of the things I love about this piece is that it is actually showing the physical aspects of what it means to actually meditate in that space, but also juxtapose it with an actual physical manifestation of the mandala. I'm gonna go through these. I'm gonna go show you a lot of images. um, this is one of my favorite pieces he did, actually, that I used to talk about in my class a lot. Obviously, it's in this kind of three-dimensional kind of graffiti style. Um, It's a sand painting, actually, that he would do. He actually blew out his knees doing this. Actually, he did it so many times that, he was on his knees doing it. He had to have orthoscopic surgery. It's pretty intense. And that's one of the things I liked about his work, too, is that he literally put himself on the line to actually make a lot of the work. And this is the word Om, actually. Om, as a meditative chant, as a graffiti symbol. So again, merging these different types of like vernacular cultures, religious cultures, different practices into one space. And I just really thought that that was just a fascinating aspect. So when I got a chance to meet him and become friends with him, it was really kind of just empowering to do so. So I was teaching this class, like I said, called Visual Culture of Hip Hop. This is actually a form study based off of the rapper MF Doom. And so it was a design class that actually was taking the idioms of hip hop, the different cultural practices of hip hop, and then and actually teaching a design studio using this practice. And actually, this is a student show that we did at the end of the semester. So you can see some similarities in how we're thinking about pastiche, about sampling, about bricolage, about kind of juxtapositions as well. So over the last for the last year or so, I was having conversations with Sanford and also with Saul Williams, the remarkable spoken word artist and multidisciplinary artist as well. They're really good friends, and Saul is also a really big comic book fan. So what I was trying to do with my new comics imprint is I wanted to work on a project with the both of them in some fashion, and I didn't know what it was going to be, but I was like, hey, we should do a graphic novel together. But our schedules have not worked out. I'm still hopeful that would happen. Anyway, and I was contacted by Sergio Bessa and his team at the Bronx Museum, and Sergio is also a really big comics fan, and he was talking to Sanford about some type of graphic novel or sequential work that actually would be in conversation with the sequential aspects of his quilt work. And Sanford said, well, then you need to talk to John Jennings about it, right? Because he knew my research and my work, and yeah, and so we had a conversation and we tried to figure out something that was a little bit more abstract and not as didactic as someone teaching you about quilting, that kind of thing, right? Just talking to the audience. We wanted to have something that was a little bit more organic. So any comic book, I know this is like, any comic book fans in the audience, like people who read graphic novels? Yep, two, yeah, okay. Probably a lot more people, but they're ashamed, right? Because it's, right? Anyway, I'm a professional nerd, so I always ask people that. That's my gig. So this is a panel from Scott McCloud's book on comics. It's called Understanding Comics and the Invisible Art. And what he does is he makes a meta comic. He actually creates a graphic novel about graphic novels, and it's a phenomenal book. And in the book, he actually defines what a comic is. And so he says that comics are juxtapose pictorial and other images in the sequence, right? So they're not random. They're actually like in a very deliberate way because um, they're trying to tell a story through pictures, correct? And if you think about it, that particular definition, then it starts to open up what a comic is. And then stained glass windows start to become comics. Then tapestries start to become comics, or the words on a tap on the Trajan column start to become comics, or the Bayeux tapestry, or hieroglyphics, right? They start to become comics if you think of it that way. Anybody familiar with this piece from the Great Migration? Yes. So this particular piece by Jacob Lawrence is part of a series, from the Great Migration series. The titles of those pieces are sentences, correct? Right? They're told in a sequence. So if you walk into a space and you see Jacob Lawrence's work, he's telling you a story. So it becomes kind of an installed, like, graphic sequential work. It becomes a comic. I know. It's mind blowing, right? Anyway, but when I saw that, I was like, man, this is a comic book. Actually, this is an illustrated story. Um, and then, of course, you enter into people's work like Harriet Powers' work, right? Harriet Powers was a slave woman whose work, there's only a few works of hers that were actually collected or that survived. But essentially what she was doing was she was creating an illustrated story from things in the Bible, right? So according to that definition, I'm like, well, how is this not a comic to me too? So you see like the connections between like the sequential aspects of, you know, different types of visual storytelling and abstraction, because again, cartooning, that is a type of abstraction, by the way. Um, and you could see like the comics persist depending upon which medium that you use, right? Which I think is very fascinating. So then I started looking at some of Sanford's work where he was doing these three-dimensional quilts, and I was like, oh my God, this is first of all, this is fantastic. I never thought it starts to change the utility of the quilt. Of course, it's not necessarily a quilt anymore. It becomes this really beautiful sculptural object um, that starts to transcend the original usage of the piece. And I started to see like, okay, well, how can I take the aesthetics of the work he's doing and actually put it into a graphic narrative? Um, he told me to look at some of the work by Kurosawa. He's very much influenced by Asian culture, Japanese culture, and in some ways, I mean, he is a reification of those different cultures because of the work that he's producing, right? Having lived in Japan for a number of years, and being like really into the culture. So I was like, well, how do I actually like not just go with just a general aping of like a Kurosawa film or something like that? How do I actually take the abstractions that he's working on and then put them into a piece, right? So what I did is I actually kind of sampled this particular process. I found it fascinating, and I started thinking about time travel a lot too, because he was kind of bending time, or bending like or creating attention as far as like how those particular types of works are used. Um, so I still wanted to do some kind of reference to Japanese culture. Um, since there's not like a lot of readers of comics, then I'm sure you're not familiar with Grant Morrison's The Invisibles, right? This particular origami piece is actually a time machine. The Invisibles is this far out science fiction graphic novel from DC Comics, and basically these particular characters would encounter all these different science fiction contraptions. This particular piece of origami represented the fact that not only can you jump through alternative spaces, but you can jump into alternative time zones too, which I found fascinating. So when I saw that, I was really into the fact that it kind of reminded me of what Sanford was doing with the three-dimensional quilts. So that was one of the inspirations. Another inspiration was Phyllis Alicia Perry's book Stigmata, which actually uses a quilt as a artifact or a diegetic prototype in the work to actually excavate issues around trauma and survival of Black women through slavery. And the quilt is actually a huge part of it, right? And it's a time travel story. It's a possession story. I don't know if you've read it before, but I think it's quite brilliant. One of these days, I want to adapt it, putting it out there into the universe. And of course, I'm a huge Sandman fan too. So Sandman, of course, is from Vertigo Comics. It's a DC comic, and it's about the God of Dreams. Actually, it's about to be a Netflix show. And I was really into Neil Gaiman's writing and how he takes like symbolic representations and makes them into anthropomorphic entities. Something we've been doing for generations and generations, right? If you look at like the Greek gods or the Egyptian gods or what have you, they're essentially like reifications or avatars of abstract ideas, right? So he's Dream, you know. By the way, Netflix show looks awesome. I can't wait to check it out. Um, and so I was thinking about this idea. Well, what if I actually created an avatar of quilting, you know? And what would that particular being be? So that's why I came up with the idea of Mother Patchwerk, and it goes back to the ideas that we were talking about for this particular collaboration, where the person who's speaking to us through the poem, through the art piece, is the avatar of quilting as a process, you know, throughout history, you know, and that was the idea. Now, when I started working on this, found out that my wife was pregnant with our first child, Jackson, and suddenly my time got really short. so, so I actually reached out to my friend David Brame, who was a longtime collaborator of mine, to actually help out with the illustration work, and I wanted to kind of figure out a way to actually get the job done and and figure out how to actually like get these ideas out without staying up all night and not being there for my wife while she was pregnant. So that was what was happening. So here's some of the work that me and David have done together. I'm a colorist. If you know anything about comics, they're done by teams of people. You have someone who's a writer, you have someone who's a penciler, you have an inker, you have a colorist, editor, so on and so forth. That's how they get done so quickly. So the piece on the left is David Brame's original artwork in pen and ink, and the final piece, that's my colors on his work. So these are just tests to kind of like show how we could collaborate together. So we're trying to figure out how to work together through these pieces. So these are kind of like practice pieces. And over the years, we'd actually end up working together on quite a few things. We've also worked on After the Rain, which is one of the first books from my imprint Megascope with Abrams Books. And here's some pages from that. Again, David did all the drawing and inks, and I finished the colors. I did the adaptation from Nnedi Okorafor's short story. So that gives you an idea of how we work together, what that looks like when we work together. Then enter my former student, Esperanza Bay, who is now at, I think she's at the SF MoMA now, getting ready to get into grad school. And I brought her on as someone to help with edits and actually be like an assistant to me. But then she started editing my copy. So it was like really hard. So I was like, well, you're actually kind of rewriting things. It's a difference between like editing someone's work and then actually rewriting it. But she felt really like attached to the work. So I was like, well, why don't you just become a collaborator and actually work on the piece with me? And I felt that it was a sign that we really should have like a Black woman's voice on the project anyway, right? And so she actually became an active collaborator on the piece. So process-wise, what I started doing was taking Sanford's, sampling Sanford's pieces and started creating my own designs based off of some of the motifs that he was creating in his pieces. And then what David would do is he would respond. So it was like a call and response kind of project where I would send him work, he would send me back work, and then I would edit it and send it back. And it really was like call and response. And we were using Dropbox as kind of like the midpoint. So it drops them in Dropbox, he'll download it, remix it, send it back to me until the piece was finished. Then, of course, I was working on the verbiage and the lettering with Esperanza and trying to figure out what that was looking like as well. So these are just some of the drawings that we did together while we're working on the final piece that was animated that you just saw. Both of us work digitally, so all these pieces were done on the iPad Pro using this program called Procreate. So basically, it's you download the app. It's only like $11, and you use the Apple Pencil to draw directly on the screen. And it was very useful to edit this way. And this is just like some of the sketches that were being done while we're in process of making the work. You can see the coloring process here too. So I'm going to show you really quickly if you haven't seen the catalog, what the actual finished pieces look like before they were animated. And these are the spreads of the book. So this, what you're seeing is like the left and the right pages juxtaposed. So what we're trying to do is create something that actually could function as a quilt itself. Essentially, it was a story, but also color-wise, pacing. We're trying to figure out, well, how do these particular images work together as a visual narrative? It ended up being a 20-page piece that is, I think, like the third. It's really cool because the book itself, the final book, I think it's like 11 by 11 inches. It's a perfect square, and it's really nice to see the work in that particular format. So it was really interesting because after Sergio had like edited the piece, I think I had done them separately at first. I had thought of them as swatches, and he was the one that suggested, okay, can we have them jump the border so they're not so like just cut off or what have you? And but basically, we were getting ready to go to the hospital soon for Jackson's birth, and he said, "Well, you can wait a little bit. You can actually just wait a couple of days." I was like, "No, no, 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 no. If it needs to happen right now." And so or it won't happen for a while. So I sat down, and after like about 8 hours or so, I went through and actually just made the edits and sent it to him, and he approved them. And so that's how that happened. What's really interesting right now, I just finished a piece called Protocol and Response, and it's for this period room that is being created by Hannah Butler, who was the set designer for the Black Panther. And I was part of the convening around like just thinking about what that particular space was going to look like, along with people like Zoe Whitley, Ryan Coogler. It was pretty amazing actually, just to sit and like talk about what this period room was going to be. The idea was that the Seneca Village, which is like basically a bunch of Black people that lived in the New York area, were just kind of pushed out because of the creation of the of Central Park. So the period room is like, what if that didn't happen? And so it becomes an Afrofuturist period room to a certain degree. So they commissioned me to make a comic to kind of explain that part. So actually, Mother Patchwerk is referenced in the comic. So I thought it was kind of cool to do kind of a crossover between like the character that he created for this particular show with this other show. So and here's just a few pages from that. But this is going to be in their members catalog that they send out to kind of like talk about the show. So this is where I pivot to talk about like how I got into doing this kind of work. So I started off as a graphic design professor and doing a lot of curatorial work around representation in comics and that kind of thing. First major show was in 2008. It was called Out of Sequence, Underrepresented Voices in American Comics, which I co-curated with Damian Duffy at the University of Illinois at the Krannert Art Museum. And it was kind of a response to this show called the Masters of American Comics, which came out of the Hammer Museum, actually out here. And one of the things we recognized was there were no women in the show, so women can't be Masters of American Comics, I suppose. And there were very few. Well, actually, there's only one person of color in the show too. And so we wanted to create something that was a little bit more open-ended. So we created again like a giant gallery comic where people could actually access the comics in a very different way. And it's funny too because I often think about the connection between the vernacular of comics and the gallery space. For instance, the corner piece there is by Mark Staff Brandel, and he does abstract gallery comics, so they're meant to be installed into comics, into gallery spaces. And there's always been this kind of tenuous, I think, connection between the two. We have people who are like Kerry James Marshall, who worked on this piece called Rhythm. I think it was called Rhythm Master. That he's been working on for a while. It's a graphic novel, but he's celebrated as this quote unquote fine artist. But there's always like a kind of a pivot between the two of those spaces. So we wanted to kind of challenge that idea. This is from a show at the Schomburg in Harlem that I co-curated with Ronaldo Anderson called Unveiling Visions, The Alchemy of the Black Imagination. And so it was looking at was the graphic ephemera connected to speculative fiction by and about Black people, but also creating like these artifictions, like these fictitious artifacts as well. Some were coming from the Schomburg's archives, and others we were creating in relationship to other things. The other thing I've been doing too is actively curating shows and visual pieces about Black independent comics. So this is the follow up to a book called Black Comics that came out in 2009, I believe it was. No, 2010. Sorry. This book came out a couple of years ago from Magnetic Press. It was a follow up called Black Comics Returns. That basically is a coffee table book that has about 100 or so African American independent comic artists that are working, and it's still available through Magnetic Press. So this is just some of the spreads from that book. Basically, over the last I don't know 15 years or so, I've been doing like a lot of work around Black vernacular culture, popular culture, science fiction and fantasy, race and horror. I teach classes on race and horror, and also just like comics and contemporary culture. You know, just kind of looking at the medium of comics and how it exists in the public sphere. So, and again, I'm going to race through these because I want to get to questions actually. So the other thing I've been doing too is putting together Black comic book conventions. So working with the Schomburg, we created the uh, the Black Comic Book Festival, which happens every pre-COVID, every Martin Luther King weekend. So at first, we started off with about 1,200 people that came to a one day event, and the Schomburg was they were gobsmacked that so many people came, and it was all Black creators, all Black publishers, and it was a lot of people, right? Over the years, it grew. It's been around for a decade now. So now, pre-COVID, the 2 day event now, because I don't know if you've been to the Schomburg in Harlem, but it's not a convention space; it's a library, right? And imagine 10 to 12,000 people in that space over a 2 day period. It's the largest Afrocentric comic book convention probably in the world at this point. And so we're coming up on our 10th anniversary. One of the things that I was really moved by was just the Black family to that space and see themselves reflected in the creators, in the space. I mean, it's one of the blackest spaces on the planet, right? This is where, W.E.B. Boys' papers are there. You have Aaron Douglas's work like hanging on the walls willy nilly, right? You have Zora Neale Hurston's work is there. Langston Hughes, some of Langston Hughes's ashes are actually in an urn under a cosmogram of the Negro Speaks of Rivers. Like it's like blickety black. It's on Malcolm X Boulevard. It's like it has a gravitational pull almost, right? Because it's so. But it also now houses something like this, right? And so what I loved about this work was that I was watching a conversation between Bell Hooks and Theaster Gates, and she was asking about like the training of an MFA and how it relates to his work and how it relates to you know what happens after graduate school. And of course, as you know, he's a potter, right? He's a ceramicist and sculptor, but he's been using his work to sell and then make these spaces in Chicago that are like these public spaces. And so what he said was it stuck with me forever. He said that basically the MFA, the Masters of Fine Arts, it gives you a certain set of skills, right? And you can actually apply those skills to almost any type of medium, right? And what he said was that he was still making vessels, but instead of using pots and ceramics, he was using spaces, like actual spaces, and bringing people together to share in those vessels. So what I thought about when we created this space, I'm a designer, and so I'm always looking at like, well, how do we get at like problem solving issues around space? How do we get at like, I'm thinking about representations. I'm thinking about like the fact that, you know, studies show that people who don't see themselves reflected in media, it actually affects their subconscious. It affects how they move through the world. And of course, there's this term called symbolic annihilation that comes out of sociology. It gets coined in like the 1970s. If you don't show someone, then you're kind of symbolically killing them, right? What does it feel like to not see yourself reflected back at you, right? So what I started thinking about is instead of like just creating a show or a place where people can empower themselves financially, we're redesigning to a certain degree Black subjectivity. So you have like, I think the number is like now 60,000 students have come through this space, and now you have an entire generation of kids who who don't have to who don't have to feel isolated or left out, and who never have to know what it means to not be the subject of a story. And that's one of the things I love about that space. So this isn't the new iPhone coming out. This is actually like, this is the first time we realized that we were onto something. This is actually in the middle of January, and people are lined up around the Schomburg, a library, to get in and see Black creators of comics, independent Black creators of comics, by the way. People who like, maybe waitresses or bouncer or something like that, and go home and then make comics and sell them in these spaces. So then what I started doing, like Johnny Appleseed, I started actually making other comic book spaces for ethnocentric conventions. So I worked with my friend Frederick Luis Aldama and Ricardo Padilla, who actually runs this con out here called the Latin Comics Expo. And we came up with this idea called SoulCon and started doing a Black and Brown comic book festival. And it's been very successful. And of course, there's others that I've co-founded over the last like 6 years. The other thing that I've been working on too, I'm from Mississippi originally, and a lot of times the idea of the future does not get connected to the South. A lot of times the idea of a haunted Black experience comes from the South, the specter of slavery, these types of things. But if you think about it, a lot of the people who are connected to Afrofuturism come out of the Deep South. That includes people like Sun Ra. Sun Ra is actually originally from the South. He becomes, this ridiculously talented, mystical jazz musician in Ohio much later. But as I recall, I think he's from Arkansas originally. And people like Henry Dumas, or Maurice White from Earth, Wind and Fire, Zora Neale Hurston, even Dr. King, I think, is an Afrofuturist. I always say that, when Dr. King talks about like this mountaintop where people are getting together and they're like joining hands and this particular type of, very colorful, beautiful language, if you take out your phone right now, you cannot find that particular mountaintop on your GPS, right? Right? You can't. It doesn't exist yet. It doesn't exist in actual space. So he's actually using a Black radical imagination to actually create this idea of a free space, right? So anyway, we went back to Jackson State University, where I went to undergrad and taught, and I created this thing called, with Rico Chapman, called Planet Deep South. Because a lot of times people treat the Deep South like it's this other planet, right? So we just kind of dialed into that idea and created this work, and actually like a 3-day seminar. I think it was 3 days, right? Okay, she was there. And these are some of the artworks that were created to go with it. So a little bit more, I actually, some kind of way, was fortunate enough to be in a space where a lot of the work that I've created has been connected to some of the more seminal texts around Afrofuturism, like Ytasha Womack's book on Afrofuturism. I have some of my own work that deals with like the Black cyborg. And over the last, decade or so, there's been kind of like a movement of Black independent artists, scholars, curators, who have kind of fostered an extremely interesting new way of looking at Blackness in the future through speculation. And this actually was before Black Panther happened. Black Panther, I think, the film, was kind of a watershed moment, but in this particular case, the Academy didn't have to play catch up. They were actually ahead of the power curve and actually started pushing the conversation a lot. Before Black Panther came out, we had already had like a decade of looking at this particular space under our belts, just waiting for something like it to happen. So between Get Out and Black Panther, you get this kind of like explosion of like, what is Afrofuturism, in the popular discourse. This is a cover I did for a Mothership book by Bill Campbell's company, Rosarium. This is some of the artwork I've done over the last few years. Abstract Comics, actually. Ask me about that later if you want. And again, as a designer, as an artist, I've always been lending my voice to the promotional work that goes behind this, to trying to establish what the aesthetics of Afrofuturism may or may not be, these types of ideas. To end really quickly, one of the things that I've become widely known for is co-adapting the seminal graphic novel by Octavia E. Butler called Kindred, which is a time travel narrative about a young woman named Adana Franklin who's in an interracial marriage, and she's from the area, right? She gets inexplicably transported from like then 1976 into the mid 1800s in Maryland in a slave plantation. And this happens periodically throughout the story. Without a time machine, she doesn't have a TARDIS or a DeLorean or anything like that. She's actually being pulled back for some kind of power that's actually pulling her back. And what it does is it gives us a space where we can talk about the legacies of slavery, the things we have not dealt with to this day, actually, and using the speculative to actually have that uncomfortable conversation. And little by little, she starts to realize that she's related to these white people that actually own these slaves on this plantation, and that she has to save her great, 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 probably great grandfather so that she and her relatives can actually live. So it's this really twisted, like, grandfather paradox. Anyway, so these are some of my illustrations for like the character designs for the book. My friend and I, Damian Duffy, that I mentioned earlier, were the co-adapters. We did this in 2000 and I forget. My brain is fuzzy on when we did it. Actually, a few years ago. And when it came out, it debuted at #1 on the New York Times bestsellers list. We won the essentially like the Oscars of comics, which is called the Eisner Awards for it. And also has opened up a lot of opportunities around other types of work that we've been into, including like doing more of her adaptations. We just finished Parable of the Sower. I'll show you some pieces from that. Currently, we're working on Parable of the Talents. This is the work that we're doing right now. And I'm hoping to do Wild Seed. That's the first piece that I read was Wild Seed. But these are just some of the pages from that artwork. The company that put this out is called Abrams Comic Arts. Abrams, if those of you who are art historians might know that they were the first art book company in the country. They were founded in 1948, I think, or 46 by Harry Abrams. They started out doing art catalogs and things of that nature. And then I think in the mid 80s started translating over to doing like popular culture and then eventually doing work like this. So now they're doing like, historical fiction and comics and all kinds of things. A lot of pop culture work too. Any Mandalorian fans in the audience? The Mandalorian. So they did the art book for the Mandalorian. So man, we need more nerds. Anyway, anyway. All right. So this is some of the work that I did for Parable of the Sower. Again, with my really good friend Damian Duffy, that I've been working with for like the last 17 years or so, to adapt this extremely prescient work into. I know it's kind of terrifying, right? Yeah. So this came out in January, actually, and now it's in softcover. Both are still available through Abrams. But because of the success of these particular comics, I was actually able to pitch the idea of doing a new imprint with Abrams called Megascope that deals with speculative fiction by and about people of color, right? So science fiction, fantasy, horror, and we just launched in the middle of a pandemic, so it's been a little rocky, but sales have been pretty decent. Um, and I'll show you. Well, actually, I don't have any pieces from those, but this is just some of the stuff I've been up to over the last few years. Again, Abrams Megascope just launched, and now we're getting ready to do our second tier books. And all these particular books are now available wherever you can find them. I get the name Megascope from the 2000. Well, basically, it was written in 1909, I think. But it's this short story by W.E.B. Du Bois. That's a science fiction story that was kind of it was a critique of the U.S. Steel industry, and it's called The Princess Steel. And inside of it is this device that is actually used as a framing mechanism, and it's called a megascope. And it's this device that can actually see through time and space. So I thought it would be a really cool kind of shout out to Du Bois, but also a great name for an imprint. All right, that's where I'm gonna stop. I feel like I've talked too long, and I guess I'll take questions, or you can throw things, or it's only soft things. Though I got to go home, so thank you. All right. Is this the same? Are we using this mic or is there another? Oh, I don't know if it's fair to give him the microphone.
You know I'm gonna get you. Good to see you. But
Good to see
knowing
you as
your
well, brother.
history and from way back, talk about the biggest transition from the South to the East and now on the West Coast as it related to your whole creative cycle. How did you stay true to your own identity as art through the different regions of the country?
That's a great question. This is my friend Lionel Griffin, wonderful photographer. Thank you for coming, and thank you for the question. So, I found honestly, like the more that I moved away from the South, the closer I became spiritually and like aesthetically. So now I primarily make a lot of work about, what it means to be a Black Southern man in that particular space and moving through the world in that space. So it honestly wasn't a huge transition. I think what I had to do was actually kind of eschew the some of the tumultuous aspects of what it means to be from that space. Sometimes I say, well, you're not from Mississippi, you survive it. Sometimes I say that. And other times I'm like, it's one of the best experiences that could have happened to me, right? And so, like most experiences, you take the good with the bad. But I think aesthetically, the work that I've been doing now is probably the most Southern and the most like centered in that space that I've ever done. So I really did take those teachings and take my culture with me in those different spaces and actively, make work from that space these days. Y'all need to read more comic books, by the way. There's a question in the back. Somebody is reading. Okay, he's got the Learn to Read Comics shirt on. I'm like, yes.
Hello. First, my sister's a principal in New York City, and I told her about the Schomburg exhibit, and she brought her whole school there. So, and she said it was a great event and
Thank you.
very culturally representative. I guess my question is, how do you find your students receive, Afrocentric, comics or Afrocentric themed narratives?
Let's see. So I made a transition from teaching graphic design in like art schools. So for like 20 years or so, I was a studio teacher. So I taught graphic design history, design methodology, like I said, classes on hip hop and design and things of that nature. And then I made a transition when I moved out here, actually. So now, like I said, I teach at the University of California at Riverside in a media and cultural studies program. And I found that the students who've been taking my courses now, which are mostly lecture classes, have been a lot more open-minded about learning about comics as a medium, learning about storytelling, and then learning about these particular ideas that are kind of embedded in Afrofuturism or Black speculative culture, whatever you want to call it. I haven't had a lot of people saying, I'm not going to take this course, that kind of thing, or this class is whatever, right? I don't know. I just felt like because of I guess I would say the priming of the mentality of like how like Afrofuturism became this kind of like buzzword because of films like Get Out and Black Panther and so on and so forth, that they were interested to learn more about it. And it's interesting because, and I tell them this all the time, is like when I first started designing the class, it was harder to find information about Afrofuturism, and now it's a embarrassment of blessings. Now, there's so many people writing about it and having book lines and shows and things of that nature. I mean, even Sanford Biggers is considered, I think, in some ways, situated in that particular space. He was in a show called The Shadows Took Shape a few years ago that was, looking at exploring Black speculative culture. So overall, I found them to be very welcoming. And I feel like, that there's been like very little tension about it. I've been very fortunate.
Hey, I have another traveling question, and maybe in the theme of Codeswitch as well, is that what I love about what you shared tonight is that you seem to move through so many categories: literature, film, graphic design, art. We're sitting in a museum now, and And I wondered if you could just speak to that. Like, and you know, in the art world, we love our categories so much, but you seem to have a really fluid pace through which you move through all of these different categories. Maybe you could speak to that experience of working with so many different kinds of collaborators and spaces.
Well, I think the first thing is, and I think this relates to Griff's question, is that I think you have to find yourself in the medium that you are in, you know. And I think that, again, referencing what Theosta Gates said, once you understand like these particular operating practices, you start to apply that particular training or that particular mindset as an epistemology to see things the same way. And I want to say like teaching hip hop as a visual culture actually changed the way that I look at the space a lot too, because there's this notion of equivalence, right? Where like, you know, what hip hop does is it samples everything like it's an asset. It looks at everything as the same. It's like making a quilt, you know, it's the same kind of idea. It's the practicality of that particular material, you know, that you sew together to make this like representation that is useful and beautiful, right? And I feel like when Greg Tate said that hip hop or that DJ culture is like ancestor worship, I really take that very seriously too. So what I started doing is just like really thinking about like, well, how do I become better at the things that I want to do? How do I become a better storyteller? How to become a better, you know, teacher? And I found myself, you know, becoming better at understanding like women and gender studies or sociology or culture anthropology, you know, that kind of thing. And I got to the point where I became interdisciplinary or uncategorizable, as you said, on purpose, and grew out of the space that sometimes is actually really a lot more limiting than you think in the arts, actually, because of the fact that, you know, the medium is always married to the person. Like you're a painter, you're a photographer, you're this, you're that, you know, and you become, you know, the thing that you do, you know, which I tried to kind of avoid doing. And I think that idea of like using hip hop as an aesthetic, but also thinking about my trainer as a designer. So as a designer, you have to learn about everything. For instance, if someone comes to you and they say like, I have a poster design for this Ludacris concert. So, well, I'm not a fan of Ludacris. I have to learn about him. That kind of thing, right? So you start to become like this, you know, I don't know, this proactive learner constantly, you know, and you know, and I have like a lot of curiosity and passion about many subjects, and I think that's actually helped too. And sometimes, to my colleagues' chagrin, I actually kind of push back against a lot of those things too. Like I can definitely say that some of the things that I've taught in my design classes or in my history classes have not exactly been accepted, you know. And I find that the coursework that I'm doing now and the program that I'm in now is extremely interdisciplinary. I really love teaching in that space. I want to say that EDS is probably this really beautiful collection of like scholarly warriors, you know, and I just felt like really at home doing that. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think it's a mindset, it's a choice to work that way. And you know, and boxes are boring sometimes, you know, unless you bust them open and then, you know, break dance on top of them, then they become a lot more interesting. I think that's sign language for bus, by the way. So, anyway.
Okay. Have you? Oh,
Who's
yeah.
talking to me? Oh, okay, sorry.
So have you been approached by any movie studios, Hollywood, or so forth, in reference to taking that step from what you have there and placing it on the big screen?
Yes, that's all I can say about that. So, but thank you for that question. Yeah. It seems like the natural step, right?
You've had a chance to work on Octavia Butler's material.
Yes.
Is there any other intellectual property or books that you would love to transform into a graphic novel or any other media to reach more people, or just to transform it into another piece of work?
Yes, there is. Actually, I'm gonna speak this into existence too. I'm a huge fan of Henry Dumas's work. So I really want to. He was a phenomenal writer during the Black Arts Movement, and was killed in his Jesus year. He was 33 when he was killed by a transit cop in Harlem, and he was friends with Sun Ra, and he was coming back from a practice with Sun Ra, and was killed. And he was extremely prolific and did a lot of work that would be considered. Amiri Baraka call him I think we call him an Afro-Surrealist expressionist. Was equally as good with poetry as with short stories, and his work is just phenomenal. So I'm in the process of trying to figure out how to do that. There's some other things I really can't speak about at the moment. I really want to do Captain Blackman as well, by William Johnson. Is that right? Yes, William Johnson. Time travel narrative as well, about Black soldiers, and it's about a man who's injured in the Vietnam War, and then his spirit kind of jumps into different Black soldiers throughout history. So, yeah, and there's a few other things. I really want to do some more horror stuff too. 'Cause I'm a really big horror fan. So there's some work by Tananarive Due and like Victor Laval that I'm really interested in as well. So hopefully that'll happen as well. But I also want to do a lot of my own stuff. So.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk this evening. So I find that when I'm talking to my students that I tell them that you can't exactly teach Black history without Black culture and vice versa. But for myself as a professor, I find myself like so creative that I go like all over the place, like with whatever I want to share with my students. So I'm curious to know how you, as a creative, as an instructor, how do you kind of fine tune that to make them still interested and engaged in the material, but also where you don't exactly lose them, but you're still kind of like living out your passions?
I mean, honestly, I know it's a simple answer, but it's like I just do like practice. It's kind of like saying like, well, how do you throw the perfect punch, right? You throw a lot of punches. You have to get. I've been doing this for a long time. I've been teaching since I was 27. I'll be 51 in November, and I've made a lot of mistakes. I've created like really bad projects that totally fell flat, and I think what happens is you just start to figure out what the students need, how to get it across, what are the different touchstones, and try to stay current with what's happening around you, and don't become like a fossil, and really try to relate, through the key concepts that you want to get across, then keep that particular thing at the center of the syllabus or at the class or what have you. And because at the end of the day, you're right, I'm really teaching Black history, Black culture, politics of resistance, all these different things we want to talk about, but through comics or through, race and horror, and just have very real conversations about those things. In my race and horror class, for instance, the first thing we talk about is like real racial horror. So they get exposed to, lynching and Jim Crow and just different oppressive spaces, and then think about like, well, okay, these are things that happen in history. How can we then use speculative fiction or storytelling to give us a safe distance away from those things, And so those are the kind of conversations that I'm trying to have in my head when I'm designing a class. And the other thing too is, you bring in other people too. Like you bring in other people to speak to your classes who are experts in those areas. I'm not an expert in everything. I don't know everything at all. So, so what I do is I try to actually like have people who've written the books that I'm teaching or who've written the articles that I'm teaching actually come to the class and maybe like sometimes I'll trade a speaking engagement or something like that. I do that all the time. It's like, okay, you speak in my class, speak in your class, that kind of thing. But it keeps it fresh. And yeah, it's like a quilt, right? So I brought it back around. It's like a quilt. Anyway, I'm about to cough. Excuse me. Is that it? Okay. Thank y'all.
All right. Thank you again to all of you for joining us. Thank you to John for this generative and insightful conversation. We invite you to visit the galleries behind us for Codeswitch if you were not able to visit beforehand. And also the exhibition catalog is on sale in the back for $38.15, tax included. So we invite you to purchase it before leaving if you'd like. Thank you again. Get home safely and have a great night. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.